Most people instinctively think money is wealth. The more money you have, the wealthier you are. Simple. Except that's not really true. Think about a hockey game. On one side of the arena is a scoreboard. The scoreboard matters because it tells us who's winning. But the scoreboard isn't the game. The real action is happening on the ice. The players are skating, passing, shooting, and scoring. The scoreboard is just tracking what's happening. Money works in a surprisingly similar way. The dollars in your bank account aren't wealth itself. They're a way of measuring and exchanging wealth. The real wealth is everything those dollars can buy. Food, homes, cars, factories, medicine, technology, energy, and the skills and labor of millions of people. Money is the scoreboard. The economy is the game, and that's where things start getting interesting, because changing the scoreboard isn't the same thing as changing the game. Throughout history, governments have repeatedly faced the same temptation. A war becomes expensive. A recession hits. A financial crisis erupts. Somebody inevitably asks, why don't we just create more money? After all, it sounds easier than raising taxes, easier than cutting spending, easier than making painful political decisions. And to be fair, creating money isn't always a bad thing. In fact, modern economies do it all the time. Which brings us to another common misconception. Most money isn't physical cash. It's digital. Numbers on screens, entries in databases. In fact, most of the money you use every day has never existed as paper. It's just information, which means modern money creation often looks less like a printing press and more like a computer keyboard. And that ability became incredibly important in 2020. The day the world hit pause. Think back to March 2020. Businesses were shutting down, airports were nearly empty, restaurants closed, millions of people suddenly found themselves out of work, entire industries were thrown into uncertainty almost overnight. Now imagine you're a policymaker during that moment. You have two terrible options: do too little, and the economy could collapse into a deep depression. Do too much, and you might create problems later. Governments around the world chose action. Trillions of dollars were spent. Emergency benefits were introduced. Businesses received support. Central banks slashed interest rates and injected enormous amounts of money into financial systems. The goal wasn't to make people rich. The goal was to keep everything from falling apart. And in many ways, it worked. The economy didn't completely collapse. Millions of families stayed afloat. Businesses survived long enough to see better days. But there was one thing governments couldn't create: more stuff. And that turns out to be important. The pizza problem. Imagine a town with 100 pizzas. Normally, there's just enough money circulating for people to buy those pizzas. Prices remain fairly stable. Now imagine everyone in town suddenly has twice as much money. How many pizzas exist? Still 100. Nothing about the pizza supply changed. Only the amount of money changed. Now more people can compete for the same pizzas. And when more money starts chasing the same number of goods, prices tend to rise. This is one of the simplest ways to understand inflation. The economy isn't made of dollars. It's made of things that take time to grow, build, mine, manufacture, transport. And unlike money, those things can't be created with a few keystrokes. Now here's where things get a little more complicated. Inflation isn't automatically a sign that something is broken. In fact, most central banks actually want a small amount of inflation, usually around 2% per year. That might sound strange. Why would anyone want prices to rise? Because a small amount of inflation can encourage spending and investment. It keeps money moving through the economy. It gives businesses confidence to expand. It helps prevent the economy from getting stuck. The problem isn't inflation itself. The problem is losing control of it. And once inflation starts accelerating, it can create a chain reaction. Workers ask for higher wages because prices have risen. Businesses raise prices to cover those higher wages. Suppliers raise prices because their costs increased. Consumers rush to buy things before prices climb even further. And suddenly, inflation starts feeding itself. At some point, inflation stops being purely economic. It becomes psychological, people begin expecting prices to rise, and those expectations can push prices even higher. That's when central banks start getting nervous. During the pandemic recovery, consumers returned to spending at the exact moment supply chains were struggling. Factories couldn't keep up. Shipping delays spread around the globe. There was more money circulating, but there weren't enough goods available. And prices responded accordingly. Most inflation is manageable, but history shows what happens when governments push things too far. After World War I, Germany experienced one of the most famous cases of hyperinflation in history. Prices rose so quickly that some workers were paid multiple times per day. Every day, people would rush to spend their wages before prices increased again. Decades later, Zimbabwe experienced something similar. At one point, trillion-dollar banknotes were printed. Not because people were becoming unimaginably wealthy, but because the currency itself was losing value at an astonishing rate. The details of these crises were different, but they shared one important feature. The scoreboard stopped reflecting reality. More and more money was being created, but the real economy wasn't keeping pace. And eventually, people lost trust in the currency itself, because at the end of the day, money only works if people believe it will hold value tomorrow. So yes, you can print more money. You just can't print productivity, you cannot print farmland, you cannot print oil, you cannot print skilled workers, and you cannot print the years of education it takes to become a doctor, or the expertise required to build a bridge, or the technology behind a smartphone. All of those things require real resources, real effort, real time, and those things are what actually create prosperity. Money is simply how we keep score. So, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe.